In this tutorial, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Photoshop blend modes from a photo editing standpoint and showing you lots of examples of when you can use them. Hi again and welcome. Michael Volshinovich here with another Photoshop tutorial. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/vibrantshot. So in this episode, we're going to be taking a close look at the various blend modes offered by Photoshop, and in particular, we're going to be looking at them from the standpoint of photographers and photo retouchers, and we're going to go through various scenarios of when they're useful and when you might use each of the different blend modes. Now, blend modes themselves are probably one of the most important things that you can learn about in order to properly utilize Photoshop. And basically, this tutorial is meant to give you, an introductory idea of how they work and put you on a strong footing on the subject. So we're going to go ahead and get started and sort of kick things off with the most basic blend mode, which is the normal blend mode. And essentially, all normal does is it takes anything that you have that is non-transparent, and it will replace the pixels on the layer below. So in this case, we have this layer here. If we turn it on with normal blend mode, it will replace 100% of the pixels because there's no transparency with the pixels that are in our active layer. Similarly, if we create a new layer and we essentially just kind of paint on it with a soft brush, we see that we've got some transparency kind of going out towards the edges, so the bottom layer starts to come through. But in the center, where we're 100% opaque, there is no pixels coming through from the bottom layer. So pretty straightforward there. Next layer we have is the dissolve layer, which kind of works like the normal layer, except with dissolve, if we kind of paint through, everywhere where there was opacity on the edges, it starts to kind of dissolve out rather than smoothly fading away. So it's not a blend mode that I've actually ever used before, but if you're looking for this kind of effect, that's the blend mode for you. So we're going to move on to some of the more interesting blend modes, which are essentially, we're going to look at this first block over here. And the important thing to note about this particular block is that essentially anything that is white will have no effect in those particular blend modes, and anything that is other than white will actually start to come through. So if we look at our Darken blend mode over here, essentially all Darken does is it takes any pixels that are darker in our current layer than in the layer below. It will replace the image essentially with those pixels. So if we turn on this particular layer here, we see that in the center it has really no effect because the center is almost white. So there's everything in the below layer is darker than white in this middle section. And on the outside, there's pretty much nothing in the bottom layer that is darker than the black that we have around the edges here. So we see in some places, this is a little bit darker than what we have on the active layer, so that starts to come through, but essentially on the edges, our pixels are being replaced with the black that's here. Another example of that is we have this layer over here, this sort of contrasted layer, and if we blend it in normal blend mode, we see that the layer itself lightens the lights and darkens the darks. But if we change it into darken blend mode, then essentially the lights remain untouched, and it's only the darks that are affected. So basically, that's useful again if maybe you want to blend a couple of different exposures together. You've taken a few exposures, you've got them stacked as layers, and you can just use the darken blend mode, for example, to bring out shadows or lighten shadows if you've got a lighter layer. But then you know that it won't lighten the lights as well for you. So that can be a situation where that's useful. Another common use for that that I'll use quite often is to fix, for example, flyaway hairs. Let's say I've got a couple of different flyaway hairs of a blonde person on a dark seamless. And if I want to start essentially cloning and stamping out those flyaways, in order to avoid copying some adjacent flyaways, I can just change my blend mode on the clone stamp to darken, and then I know that I'm always just copying the dark areas of the seamless over top of the hair, rather than potentially copying over some hairs as well. So we can do that as well. For example, over here, if we want to just kind of copy this blue color down, we don't want to introduce any more light anywhere, we can just change our blend mode on our clone stamp tool to darken, sample, and then just kind of paint away, and we see that that it's always darkening the pixels. Essentially, it's never it's never actually lightening them. So if we kind of toggle that on and off, we see that we darken something over there, but we never actually lightened it, and we never kind of worry about encroaching on the darker parts with the lighter parts. So that's probably the most common case. And again, another case would be where you have maybe multiple exposures. You've got a layer that is maybe one stop brighter than your active layer. You can use it, for darken or lighten blend modes to kind of achieve the desired effect. Now, moving on to the next one, which is the multiply blend mode. And essentially, with multiply, unlike in the darken, with multiply, what we're doing is we're taking the two pixel values and sort of multiplying them together. So once again, white really has no effect on this particular image. So if we, with multiply blend mode, if you turn on white, essentially what you can think of is that white has, let's say, a value of 1, and our pixel value has some sort of pixel value. 1 times anything is just going to be that same value. So white will never change anything, but as soon as we have something other than white, it will start to shine through. And so if we, for example, try and do that on this gradated layer over here, we see that we're introducing a much smoother and more natural looking vignette than we obviously did with this darkened layer below it. So if we just that's not what we want. Let's just turn this layer off. We see that with this one here, when we had this on, we were doing an actual pixel value replacement with what's in here over top of our layer below. Whereas in multiply, we're not doing a pixel replacement, we're doing an actual blending of pixel values and essentially multiplying those pixel values. So this dark area just becomes significantly darker, and anything that's light will remain the same. So again, there's no change in the middle section. The most common use for the multiply blend mode, I think, is when you're using textures. So for example, we have this texture over here, which if we just change back into normal blend mode, we see has some white, essentially like white parchment paper you can think of. And basically, this has no effect on the actual image, but wherever we have, bits of information, that will actually come through into our image. So let's just change this into multiply blend mode again, and we see that it's actually coming through and bringing some of that texture into our image. Now, if we were going to go to just darken blend mode, we see that really doesn't have much effect, because it'll only show up wherever the pixel value in this texture is darker than the pixel value of our image. And in the case of this image, it's just there's not too many places. But with multiply, we know that we're always multiplying pixel values, so we're always going to be bringing in a darker color. So again, most common scenario is with textures, and that's probably where you're going to be using multiply most often. So now moving into these color burn, linear burn type of blend modes. If we turn this on over here, we see that I've added this particular layer over here that basically has some, you can almost think of it as like graffiti over here. And basically what it does is it will apply a color primarily to lighter portions of the image. So as we can see, if we kind of made a streak over here in the darker shadowy portions of our underlying image, it doesn't have much effect. It doesn't really introduce that color into the shadow areas. It just kind of darkens the shadow areas. But wherever we have light, we see that it is actually bringing in that color quite dramatically. So basically the color burn is similar to the linear burn, except it's a more sort of intense version of it. Now if we were to take off our top layer over here and go into our gradated layer over here, basically what you can see is that it's sort of the middle grays here are really punching up the colors that are originally in the image. If we take this off, we see that there's a little bit of orange and yellow in here, and similarly here. But if we apply that layer to it, it's really just adding a ton of contrast and a ton of color, and just really bringing out those underlying hues. So it's not a layer that I use too often, the color burn, simply because it's so intense. So for most things, if I'm trying to achieve that sort of effect, I'll use the linear burn blend mode. And basically this one you can sort of think of like a toned down version of color burn. It's not as contrasty, it's not as saturated. And so if we turn on this layer over here, we see that with linear burn, it's the exact same thing that we had with color burn, but it's much more subtle and natural looking. So obviously again, you'd never really go for this kind of effect, but you see that when we kind of bring out these colors over here, they still look okay. They're not completely over exaggerated. So again, if we were to do this with this kind of paint layer over here, we see that it's a little bit smoother. In fact, sorry, that's on the wrong blend mode. There we go. It's a little bit smoother. It's not as intense. And, again, on the shadows, it does kind of the same thing as color burn does. But we see that its effect is, again, more natural and pleasing to the eye. So again, typically I think you'll be sticking to this blend mode if you're using it. And basically, a common scenario for it is if we have a sky that is, let's say, predominantly white. It has a little bit of texture in it, but we want to introduce some degree of color into that sky. What we can do is we can create a new layer, change the blend mode on that layer to linear burn, and basically we can apply a gradation to it. Let's say it's a blue gradation that goes out to white, and basically it will start to apply some additional coloring into that sky. And of course we can play with the opacity to make that effect look a little bit more natural. And really, the dark parts of the sky will be affected a lot less than the light parts, so you can basically think of it as sort of introducing some additional color into anything that is a highlight. And that's really the most common scenario for that. Now, similar to that, we have this darker color, but really all darker color it works kind of like Darken, except it works on colors themselves, so it compares color values. And if we kind of go into our paint layer over here, we see with linear burn, this is the effect we have. And if we go into darker color, basically all it's really doing is it's kind of replacing pixel values with the color value that's darker on our top layer. So again, not really so much of a blending mode, unlike linear burn and color burn. It's more of a pixel value replacement like our Darken blend mode. So that concludes the second section of blend modes over here. And we're going to move down to this block, and essentially this block is kind of the opposite, or not necessarily the opposite, but kind of the analogous variation of these top blend modes, except they operate by making things lighter. So while these ones make things darker, these ones make things lighter. So just like we had with these top layers over here, where anything essentially that was darker than white had an effect and white had no effect, anything that is lighter than black will have an effect here, and anything that is black will have no effect. So our first blend mode from that section is the Lighten blend mode. So if we go into here, activate our Lighten group, we see that this black layer has absolutely no effect when it's on Lighten blend mode. And if we look into our sort of gradated layer over here, if we activate that on Lighten, essentially anything that we have black over here is certainly not lighter than our underlying layer. So essentially those pixel values don't change at all. And the center point, where essentially we have pure white, it's of course lighter than what we have on the underlying layer, and so those pixel values are completely replaced. And again, we are replacing pixel values, we're not sort of multiplying them or merging them with the underlying layer. So just like Darken, except it lightens instead. And again, a common scenario for Lighten is, again, if you have flyaway hairs on, so maybe dark flyaway hairs on a light seamless background, then you would use the Lighten blend mode to essentially get rid of or clone stamp away those flyaway hairs without having to worry about cloning any of the dark adjacent flyaway hairs. So it just makes it really easy to get rid of the hairs because you're only ever copying the seamless color over top of the hair, and you're never copying any additional hair as you kind of work around the hair. So again, very commonly used with clone stamping. Now, screen is, again, just like the multiply blend mode, except it lightens, and the multiply blend mode darkened. So again, if we have a screen blend mode on a black layer, it has no effect whatsoever. And if we enable this sort of gradated layer over here, we see that, again, on the outside where we have black, on the very periphery, where we have black, there's no effect. But even as soon as we start to go a little bit lighter than black, even on these edges here, we see that it's brightening this portion of the image. So again, anything that is lighter than black will always lighten. And now, of course, in the center here where we have white, obviously it's lightening very drastically, but again, it's sort of a multiplicative effect where we still have the underlying layer showing up, unlike in the Lighten blend mode. But again, it's just, we get the detail, but we're lightening wherever we have anything lighter than black. So once again, just like with the multiply where we were using it most commonly for textures, it's again most commonly used here for textures too. So if we have, for example, a texture that has some light bokeh in it, light bokeh of course being light in color, and then typically shot on a dark background because we're usually shooting them at night. If you had that texture applied over here, you blended it with screen blend mode, the bokeh would come through, but essentially the black background of the bokeh would not. So, we have this texture over here essentially, which is like a smoke texture, and if we just take that opacity up and we change to normal blend mode, we see that the smoke is shot on this black background, which, as we know, will have no effect under screen blend mode, but the light portions of the smoke will. So if we change that blend mode to screen, we see that that smoke texture starts to come through and applies over top of the image. Now once again, if we change this to Lighten instead, we see that that smoke would only apply to areas that that were darker than the smoke itself. And of course it doesn't look terribly good here because we want that multiplicative effect where it looks like the smoke is kind of over top of the image and sort of blending with the image as it would if it was actually there. So again, you'd never use a Lighten blend mode to blend a texture. You'd always use screen or multiply. Now the color dodge and linear dodge methods, I think a lot of people don't tend to use these. And again, just like with the color burn and linear burn blend modes, they're used to essentially change color. So if we go into color dodge over here, we see that with this this paint layer that we have, it is essentially applying a color to the areas where we have shadowing, but less so to areas where we have highlights. So unlike the color burn, which affected the lighter areas and didn't affect the darker areas, this is sort of doing the opposite, and it's adding the color to the dark areas. So again, a common scenario for this would be if we had, for example, a landscape image. So if we turn on this image over here, and let's say we want to kind of amp up some of the colors in these shadows over here. We want to maybe introduce a little bit more redness into this area. Maybe we wanted to punch up some of the greens in these shadow areas. We can do that through here with the color dodge blend mode. So we're going to turn this layer on. We're going to grab a brush and we're going to select a red color. Now one thing you want to do is once you get your hue selected, you want to always select a color that is fairly dark within that hue. You don't actually want to choose a bright color because otherwise it'll just be ridiculously intense and it'll never really look natural. So pick a very dark color, pick a soft brush, and if we just start brushing in through this general area over here and maybe a little bit in here, we see that what we're doing is we're essentially bringing in that color, we're saturating it quite a bit, and we're also brightening it a fair bit. So if we kind of toggle that on and off, we see that that color is really coming through. And we can do the same thing with the greens, for example. If we go into our green hue over here, again pick a dark variation of that, and we start kind of brushing in here and maybe a little bit in here, a little bit on our tree. We see that as we toggle that on and off, you can really kind of see that green's coming through, but again, of course, retaining some of the information within the image, of course, never covering the pixels, but just nicely blending them in with the darker pixels that we have. So now linear dodge, again, is kind of a variation of the color dodge. It's really doing the same thing, and so if we just duplicate this layer over here, I'll show you the difference in the effect. We'll just drag it up and drag it up to the top here. So now you can see that that this has, we'll have to change that to linear dodge, there we go. It has an insanely drastic effect compared to the color dodge. And so one thing you'll always have to do immediately is to take the opacity of this way down or lower the flow rate of your brush way down if you're using linear dodge. And it may be a little bit interesting because with linear burn, this was sort of the less intense variation of the two, whereas with linear dodge, it seems like the more intense one, and it kind of is, but at the same time, you'll also find that the color dodge is a little bit more saturated, and it brings up the brightness a lot more. The linear dodge brings in the color a lot more. So again, if you want just to kind of mute the colors, you don't want them to be as prominent, you can still achieve the same effect as with the color dodge, but you just have to lower the opacity significantly more than you would have with the color dodge blend mode. So if we go back into our sort of paint section over here, we see that this one's applied with linear dodge, and again, looks very similar, but one thing you'll notice is it has, again, less effect on the lights than the color dodge does, and has a lot more effect on the black. So like this area right here was barely visible in the color dodge blend mode. If we just bring that back here, see, you don't really see that portion at all with color dodge, but with linear dodge you do see it. So if you're really trying to intensify colors within areas where it's almost black, then you'll have to use linear dodge, of course, again, reducing opacity quite drastically. But you'll also notice that the colors are a little bit less saturated than they are with color dodge. So again, the difference there is, are you operating on blacks very heavily? If you are, then use linear dodge, and otherwise I tend to stick with color dodge. I find it just gives you a little bit more control and produces a more natural effect. And finally, of course, with just like with the previous one here, if we select our paint layer and we select lighter color, really all we're doing is, again, we're doing a color comparison. So we're just replacing pixel values with colors that are lighter than the underlying layer. So that just works the same way as a darker color, more again of a pixel replacement than an actual blend of the pixels. So that essentially concludes the first three blocks of blend modes that we have over here. And I think we're going to take a bit of a break at this point and carry on with the rest of these blend modes in part 2 of this video. Now, definitely come back for that because some of the most interesting ones are yet to come, especially in this main section over here. So to make sure you don't miss those, do subscribe to our YouTube channel below, and also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/vibrantshot. We'll see you next time.